All right, so hopefully everybody got some papers coming in. We are on lesson 7, Judea under the Seleucids. We've got some folks that are visiting here this morning. I will apologize right up front, kind of sort of apologize. Really just inform you to let you know that this is a heavily history class because we're doing the intertestamental period. So if right now you're saying, I really don't want to be in this class, there's a class on the Gospel of John way down at the end of the hall, and another class on, and I can't remember the name of the topic, but Ed is teaching another class that way. So we have a couple that are more Bible-based than this one, just so that you know. And I'm aware of the fact that there's not a whole lot of Bible in this particular class. It's just the nature of the beast, okay? So we're studying the intertestamental period. We're getting us from the end of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New Testament, what's going on in there and how all those changes take place and why all that came about. And in order to do all of that, we have to spend a lot of time in history, okay? And so that's what we're doing this morning. We're continuing in that. I will tell you, if you are here on Wednesday night, Lord willing, we're going to continue in the history, but we also get to do something else that I think is just kind of neat. We're going to talk about Hanukkah and where Hanukkah comes from. And you may have looked on your calendars and discovered that Hanukkah actually starts this year on Wednesday. So if you are wondering all about Hanukkah and why that holiday is on our calendars and what that's all about, you can come Wednesday night. We will talk about that at the end of that class. I will tell you that Hanukkah, although not mentioned by name in the scriptures, is mentioned in the New Testament, okay? Not by name, all right? But it is there in the New Testament one time. It is a holiday that comes out of the intertestamental period. There are two holidays like that come, well, the other one isn't really out of the intertestamental period. It's in the period that we talked about in class. What's the other holiday? Not Hanukkah, but it's an Esther? Purim, okay? Those are two that date to this latter period of Jewish history. Hanukkah comes out of the intertestamental period. We will talk about that Wednesday night, as long as we do not fall miserably behind this morning, and I don't think that we will. All right, so this morning, Judea under the Seleucids. We've talked about Alexander the Great's kingdom. We've talked about the fact that after Alexander died, the kingdom broke up and ended up breaking up into 4 pieces. And then it really comes down to 2 pieces that are important for us, okay? There's some other pieces out there, but they're not really relevant to us in this class. They're relevant elsewhere, not here. So we've talked about the fact that the kingdom broke up, and then we've talked about the fact that the Jews are going to bounce back and forth under the control of what 2 successor empires or kingdoms? The Ptolemies in Egypt, and now the Seleucids, okay? And we talked Sunday morning that generally speaking, Jews under the Ptolemies were doing pretty well, okay? It was not a particularly difficult time for them as long as they were under those rulers who were down there in Egypt. We talked about some of the significant things that happened during that period. So, for example, a city called Alexandria that was founded by who? Alexander the Great, and it's in Egypt. You have to clarify that because there's like 20 Alexandrias that were founded by Alexander. I mean, he just went everywhere. Here's another Alexandria. We'll pop one right here, okay? Because I like my name and I want towns named after me. But the one in Egypt is really, really important because there's a large Jewish population there, and it will grow. And in fact, in the New Testament period, the Jewish population of Alexandria will be larger than the Jewish population of the city of, anybody know? Jerusalem. Okay, there will be more Jews living in Alexandria than in Jerusalem in Jesus' day. Also, something very significant that happens in Alexandria is that the Old Testament is translated into Greek. What's that translation known as? The Septuagint, okay? Very important for New Testament studies. As a matter of fact, it's important enough that it gets its own topic in this class. We'll talk about that later. So this morning, we're now going to shift gears. We're not talking about the Ptolemies anymore. They were important. They were good for the Jews by and large, good for later history. Now we're going to talk about the Seleucids. This is going to be pretty different from what we found in our previous lesson. So let's look at this. The Seleucid kingdom, just to give you some basic information, the Seleucid kingdom lasted from just after the death of Alexander in 332 BC to 63 BC. Anybody knows what happens in 63 BC to the Seleucid kingdom? Anybody just take a wild guess? They fall under the Roman Empire, okay? So Rome is out there on the horizon in this period. We're going to talk about Rome later in this class as well because that gets us to the New Testament period. But the Seleucid kingdom is centered in Asia. And in 198 BC, there is the Battle of Paneas. We talked about that. Paneas is known in the New Testament as what? What's it called in the New Testament? Caesarea Philippi. Very good. So that's where the battle takes place in 198 BC, 200 years before the time of Jesus. Because of that, Palestine comes under Seleucid control. In other words, the Jews come under Seleucid control, and that control is going to last until 142 BC. So they're going to be under Seleucid control for roughly 50 years. I will just give you a heads up and a sneak peek that date, 142 BC, they are no longer under Seleucid control because they are, anybody have a wild guess at that as well? Semi-independent. I would say they're actually probably pretty independent, at least at the beginning of that period, okay? They're going to have a revolution. We're going to talk about that kind of very briefly at the end of class. That's our topic for Wednesday night. So the Seleucid kingdom over the Jews. Let me pull up our next slide here. In 100 BC, the Seleucid kingdom is dramatically reduced, okay, the size of it. It ends up encompassing Antioch and some Syrian territory. That's a far cry from what we'll see in just a moment on a map. And then 63 BC, as we already indicated, the Seleucid lands are absorbed by the Roman Republic as a Roman province. So they become a part of not the Roman Empire, because it's not an empire yet. It's still technically a republic. They're going to be absorbed into the Roman world, if you will. We'll just say it that way. All right, so I promised you a map. There is our map. And you can look up there on the map, that big green area that goes all the way from Turkey over here. Not there, here. All the way to, well, what is this area over here? What would that be today? It's India, okay? That's the Indus River, okay? So all of this area, and you notice the borderlands down here between the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt and the Seleucid Empire, that's all the Seleucid Empire. But by the time you get to about 100 BC, they're just a little smidgen of what they once had been over here in the center. That's out of the scope of this class, so we're not going to talk about why that all happened and how that all happened, because it's just not relevant to what we're doing in this material. All right, so when we talk about the Seleucids, we've got to talk about Antiochus III, otherwise known as the Great. Okay, these guys really loved nicknames. Aren't you glad that our presidents don't have all these nicknames? Okay, I can just imagine, I mean, their opponents give them nicknames, but they themselves don't choose any nicknames. I guess they get Secret Service code words, I don't know. But Antiochus III, otherwise known as the Great, he is the victor at Paneas in 198 BC. We've talked about that, not going to beat that dead horse. Antiochus then goes to war with Rome. So here we have the Romans on the scene. Okay, we're going to talk about Rome later, but now they enter the picture. There is the war between the Romans and the Seleucids, otherwise known as the Roman-Syrian War, because the Seleucids are where? In Syria. Okay, they're centered in that area. They're not the rump state anymore that they once were. That lasts from 192 to 190 BC, so it's a 2-year war. As a result of that war, the Seleucids are defeated in Greece. Rome invades Asia Minor, and the Macedonians, in other words, the Seleucids, are defeated at Magnesia. Okay, so they lose in Greece. Rome continues on, invades Asia Minor. The Macedonians are defeated at Magnesia. As a result of that, the Seleucids are forced to abandon all territory north of the Taurus Mountains. All right, we'll see some pictures here in just a moment. Significantly for later history, Antiochus III has a son. His son is named Antiochus, and he's going to be Antiochus IV later when he's king. He gets sent to Rome as a political hostage, and he will remain there until 177 BC. In other words, the Romans say, we don't appreciate going to war with you Seleucid people over here. We think you should just bow to Roman power. But to impress upon you how powerful we are, now that you've been defeated, you get to send your son, who is going to spend, 13 years or so in Rome as a political hostage. So what happens if the Seleucids don't behave themselves, theoretically? Yeah, it might be the end of Antiochus he's not Antiochus IV yet. He will be, okay? Might be the end of him. But the other significant thing that happens is Antiochus gets to be in Rome during this period. And Rome during this period is powerful, and their power is growing. And they are becoming a mighty republic still at this point in time. They will become a mighty empire, and Antiochus will be impressed with Roman power. At any rate, he gets hauled off to Rome as a political hostage because we want, if you're a Roman, you want those Seleucids to behave themselves. So let's go ahead and look farther at Antiochus III. Again, we have a nice bust of him. Remember, during this period, When they are making sculptures, the sculptures are very lifelike. So we saw that with Alexander. You really get to see at any rate what Alexander looked like. Here you get a really good opportunity to see what Antiochus III looked like. Okay, it's a very lifelike bust of this particular individual. He dies in Persia in 187 BC. He was generally considered as friendly toward the Jews, and indeed he was. Okay, he settled, incidentally, or resettled, I guess I should say that, 2,000 Jewish families from Babylonia to Lydia and Phrygia. Lydia and Phrygia are in Asia Minor. So when Antiochus III is king, or emperor, if you will, he takes these 2,000 Jewish families and he resettles them in Asia Minor. Their descendants are still there during the first century. Okay? So think about Paul as he's traveling about to these cities, and other evangelists as they're traveling about to these cities. What are they finding where they go? Synagogues and Jewish people. Okay? Those are, some of them are, the descendants of these people that get resettled. Now, understanding that in 200 years, Jews might move around some, but these folks are resettled in that area. So you begin to see not only the Jews that have been resettled in Mesopotamia by the Assyrians, by the Babylonians, but now you get the Ptolemies resettling Jews in various areas. You get the Seleucids resettling Jews in various areas. So you end up with Jews living everywhere, okay? Now, I will tell you that is significant because that means in the New Testament period, when the message of Jesus the Messiah is able to be taken first to the Jewish population, they're going to find lots of Jewish folks living all over the place. And if you look in Acts chapter 2 and read what's called the Catalog of Nations, all those folks that are there on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, they're all Jews, but they are from all over. North Africa, Rome, Mesopotamia, okay? Because Jews have been being resettled during this period. All right, so I'm going to give you all a quote, or we're going to read a quote, I guess I should say it this way. This is a letter that is recorded in Josephus in his book, Antiquities of the Jews. I'll give you the reference there if you want to look that up. But the letter itself is from Antiochus to Zeuxis, I guess is how we'll say his name today. So the letter said this: having been informed that a sedition has arisen in Lydia and Phrygia, I thought that matter required great care. And upon advising with my friends what was fit to be done, it hath been thought proper to remove 2,000 families of Jews with their effects out of Mesopotamia and Babylon unto the castles and places that lie most convenient. All right, I'm going to stop here for just a moment. We are unfortunately cursed by the fact that our modern English, we don't have a modern English, not yet, edition of Josephus is an old edition of Josephus. And so we get all these and thous and castles and things like that. There's a new edition of Josephus that's coming out that'll be in more modern English, and maybe one of these days I'll buy that. I don't know. Okay, so unto the castles, so forgive the language, unto the castles and places that lie most convenient. For I am persuaded that they will be well-disposed guardians of our possessions because of their piety towards God, and because I know that my predecessors have borne witness to them that they are faithful and with alacrity do what they are desired to do. I will therefore, though it be a laborious work, that thou remove these Jews under a promise that they shall be permitted to use their own laws. So they get moved to Lydia and Phrygia to quell a rebellion. And why do they get chosen? Because these are really good people to have in your empire. They are by and large very loyal. And if you need them to do something, they do it very quickly. And we're going to promise them that when they get there, they get to follow their own what? Their own law. What law would that be? That would be the Old Testament, okay? So the fact that they get to go and practice their own law means that they're probably going to be disposed to go there, fondly disposed to go there, okay? When the Jews rebel, one of the main things that they rebel about is whether or not they're allowed to follow their law. Remember that for Wednesday night, okay? So if you don't mess with their law, chances are they're going to be really, really good and loyal people into my empire. So they get moved off there. And we end up with these 2,000 Jewish families that end up in that area. All right, so I promised you a map. These are the Taurus Mountains in Anatolia, otherwise known as Turkey, the modern country of Turkey. If you will notice that island right there, that's Cyprus. This is modern Syria over here, Lebanon and Israel down here. The Taurus Mountains are in this southern area. So Rome says you lose everything north of the Taurus Mountains, okay? Basically, they lose all of that area up there that had been their territory. Rome now gets it. So Rome now has a foothold in Asia Minor, okay? And knowing the Romans like we know them from later history, they don't stop with that, do they? No. Okay, so this is a photograph of the Taurus Mountains. I chose that specifically because it's nice and covered with snow, and there's snow down on the ground as well. We don't think of the Middle East as getting snow, but many parts of the Middle East, not Saudi Arabia, maybe their mountains do, but other parts of the Middle East do get snow. These are significantly high mountains. When the Romans choose the Taurus Mountains, they're choosing a natural physical barrier, all right? So everything north of that, that's ours now, okay? You can still keep what's south and southeast of that, but everything north is ours, all right? I will just point out that mountains have historically been very important barriers, okay? I remember even living in the Czech Republic before they had built a lot of the highways that they've built now. We were separated. Ivana's parents live in a city over in one valley, okay, and it really isn't a valley, and there's a line of hills. They're not even mountains, okay? We're not talking Rocky Mountains here. We're not even talking Appalachian Mountains here, all right, that separate them from the city where the church is. It's a psychological boundary, okay, even though they're not tall. We have cars today, but in the old days, I like to say that, in the old days, people wouldn't have cars, so they'd have what? Horses, wagons, carts, feet, okay? And going over even tall hills or mountains is a significant barrier. I like to joke because we used to live over on this side of 35, and there's this other physical barrier here in the area. What's that physical barrier? Anybody take a gander? A guess? The train tracks on 377, okay? When we lived on this side of 35, if we needed to go to Target, back before they built the one in Alliance, that's on the other side of the train tracks. We really had to decide whether we wanted to go over those train tracks or not, because you get stopped by a train there, traffic backs up, it's just a mess. Psychological boundaries. The Taurus Mountains are that kind of a boundary. So the Romans get everything north, the Seleucids get to keep everything south of that, at least for now. All right, that's Antiochus III. Let's move on to Antiochus IV. We're returning to this guy. He's taken off to Rome as a political hostage, okay? He gets the nickname Epiphanes. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Antiochus III is succeeded by a fellow whose name is Seleucus IV. He gets assassinated by another fellow whose name was Heliodorus in 175 BC, okay? Antiochus IV then defeats Heliodorus. Remember, there's a test at the end of class. You have to name all these guys. Defeats Heliodorus and seizes the throne, even though he was not the next in succession. He should not have been the next king, but it doesn't matter. He kills Heliodorus and he takes the throne anyways. When he does that, he assumes the title Theos Epiphanes. We call him historically Antiochus IV Epiphanes, but the full title that he takes is Theos Epiphanes. Well, that's nice, and you're sitting there wondering, what is that all about? Well, in Greek, it means God manifest. Now, that does not mean that Antiochus IV is saying, God gave me the throne, okay? We're used to kind of that idea in Jewish names, right? So Jewish names, Jeremiah, Isaiah, where you have that AH somewhere in the name. Usually it's an indication that the name of God figures into that name, okay? And they'll mean things like blessed by God or chosen by God or something to that effect. No, when Antiochus IV chooses this name, he's not giving credit to God. He is saying, I'm a god. Okay, that's what he means by that title. And we're going to see that in just a moment in one of his coins. The Jews, however, being the folks that they are with a nice dry sense of humor, Jewish humor is great, isn't it? I love Jewish humor. If you want to know what Jewish humor, if you want to know what it's really like, watch Fiddler on the Roof, and you'll see lots of Jewish humor in there, okay? It's a great movie to get a feel for Jewish humor. Well, the Jews give him another nickname. All right, you think you're Theos Epiphanes. Nah, we're going to call you Epimanes, which means the madman. Now, I don't suspect they did that to his face, but when they're talking among themselves, that's what they call him. Oh, yeah, Antiochus IV. Not Epiphanes. We're not going to call him that. He's Epimanes. He's the madman. And indeed, from their perspective, and even from the world's perspective, that's exactly what he was. All right, I promised you a coin. Here it is. Another thing that's great about this period is we get all these coins that are also very realistic. So this is a tetradrachm. If you collect coins, you might know what that is. Don't ask me. I don't know. But it's a coin. It's a silver coin. It's a tetradrachm of Antiochus IV. The Greek inscription reads, King Antiochus, God manifest, bearer of victory. Now, I want you to note in the coin that this is Antiochus, King Antiochus, right there. He's sitting on the throne. The inscription says his name, that he is Theos Epiphanes, God manifest, and he is the bearer of victory. But for the Greeks and for the Romans, victory was a god, okay? And so who's he holding in his hand? He is holding victory in his hand, and victory's got that wreath up there indicating, that Antiochus is the victor. It's very interesting iconology, because what it shows is that in Antiochus's mind, he really is a god. In fact, he's bigger than the Greek god Victory, who he's got in the palm of his hand. A different person would have probably done that coin differently. That different person would have had Victory sitting in the chair really big, and Antiochus kind of small, getting the wreath from Victory. Now Antiochus, okay? There was a reason why the Jews called him Epimanes, the madman. All right, so let's continue on. And by the way, if y'all have any questions, raise your hands, okay? We got plenty of time for questions. All right, so let's talk on about this fella. Now we get a bust of him, okay? You don't see much in that coin. This is a bust of Antiochus, so again, you get a feel for what he looked like during the period. He had an unpredictable personality. He had spent about 12 years in Rome as a political hostage. So he's taken away from mom and dad and everything that he's familiar with. He's now in Rome. He gets a certain amount of freedom, but he is still a hostage, okay? In Judea, at this point in time, a fellow whose name was Onias III, who was a very Orthodox Jew, holds the high priesthood, okay? So Onias III is the priest in Rome. In Jerusalem, the high priest. In 174 BC, Jason, who is Onias' brother, offers Antiochus IV a large tribute and purchases the office of high priest. Couple of things to note here in that statement, okay? So Antiochus IV is now a fairly new king. He wants to keep order, but he also likes money, because all kings want money, right? Because money's how you run your country. So Jason comes along. Jason is Onias' brother, and he says, I'll give you more money, you make me the high priest. I want you to notice his name. What is his name? What is Onias' brother's name? Everybody right now should say Jason. All right, Jason's a pretty common name today. It's a Greek name, okay? That tells us a whole lot about this fella. Not only is he buying the priesthood, which was against God's law, okay, but he's also one of these folks who has adopted Greek culture and been pretty happy doing that. He's even known by his Greek name, okay? So you've got one brother who's a very Orthodox Jew, follow God's law. You got another brother who says, I'll offer more money, I'll get to be high priest, because high priest in this time and in this place means you have what? You have power, okay? Because there is no king of the Jews. The king is Antiochus. So getting to be high priest means you're going to be in a very good position, probably a pretty lucrative position, because Jason views this as the ancient equivalent of the 401k. Okay, this is how you invest in the future, all right? You get to be in this office. I guess this is how you get elected to be senators and House of Representatives as well in the United States. It's a nice way to make money. I don't ever see anybody that leaves political office from Washington that comes home and lives in a modest middle-class house, right? No, they all come out wealthy one way or the other. Okay, so looking at Jason, pull up the next slide. Jason is a committed Hellenist. We already talked about that based on his name. He builds in Jerusalem a gymnasium. And in that gymnasium, Jewish boys exercise totally unclothed, okay? So when they're there exercising, they don't have any clothes on. They have nothing on, okay? If you're thinking they're just in a swimsuit and we're saying they're immodest, no, they had nothing on because that's how it was done in the Greek world. And so these Jewish boys become Greek in their thinking. They just shed all their clothing and they're, I don't know, running laps or doing whatever they did in a gymnasium. This was a part, these gymnasiums were a part of every culturally Greek city, okay? And that whole idea of taking all your clothes off to exercise, that was a part of that. In addition to that, he holds sporting events in Jewish areas. And the participants in these sporting events adopted all the pagan trappings. So everything that goes along with the Olympic Games and the other games and the sporting events, which were all dedicated to this god, that god, or maybe even multiple gods, goes on in Jewish areas. Okay, so who's doing all of that? Other Jews like Jason who are Hellenists. They've adopted Greek culture, Greek ways of thinking, Greek ways of doing things. Many Jews during this time adopted Greek names as well. We already saw that with Jason. Orthodoxy, and I love this line. This is maybe one of my favorite lines in all of these classes that I teach. Orthodoxy was viewed as obsolete. Orthodoxy was viewed as old-fashioned. And the older I get, the more I like that line. Because I find myself, regrettably so, I never thought I'd ever say it, back in my day, I think it just goes. I think when you hit 50, I think when you hit that magical age, you start to talk like that. Back in my day, we didn't do that. Well, sometimes back in my day, we didn't do those things. Sometimes we did, we just didn't talk about it. Well, other people did, and they didn't talk about it, okay? But among the Jews, you want to be Orthodox, you want to actually follow God's law? You are so old-fashioned. Or I guess the equivalent today is, you're just such a boomer, right? Y'all have heard that term, right? Everybody, I'm not even a boomer. I somehow get thrown into that category. Orthodoxy is viewed as obsolete under Jason. And remember, he has bought the high priesthood with money. All right, so Antiochus IV, he's interested in waging wars because all kings like to do that. He wages wars against the Ptolemaic kingdom because they're the nearest one. After all, Rome is pretty powerful, and he spent time in Rome, so we're not going to worry about those folks north of the Taurus Mountains because that would be very dangerous to do. But there's another empire that's closer by, and it's also a very rich empire. That would be Egypt. So in 170 BC, the Ptolemies declare war against the Seleucids. But Antiochus is victorious, and he establishes a puppet government in Egypt. Okay, we're going to keep you people in line. We're going to put a puppet government there. They're not really ruling. I'm ruling, but you're going to think that you're ruling. Okay, this was done in the ancient world. People still do it today. Okay, you establish a puppet government and who are going to be friendly to you, and you make sure then you don't have any problems with those folks. The United States never does that, do we? Oh, yeah, we have. Okay, yes, we do. We do that. And from a statecraft standpoint, that's absolutely right, because you don't want troublesome people that you have to keep going back over and quelling. So he makes a puppet government, not going to last long, because in 168 BC, Antiochus leads another invasion. He's got to go back down there to Egypt and deal with these rebellious Egyptians, okay, who are now a Greek kingdom. When he gets down there, he's met by the Roman ambassador, whose name is not lost to history. His name was Gaius Popilius Lanus. He's the Roman ambassador. Rome has got an ambassador in Egypt because Egypt is very important. Because Rome buys grain from Egypt. Because remember, the Italian peninsula historically cannot produce enough grain. The land of pasta cannot produce enough grain in the ancient world to support its population. So we're going to get, because we got these big armies, and you know, armies need food, so we're going to get all this grain from Egypt. So they've got an ambassador there. Gaius Popilius Lanus meets Antiochus. And he's got a message from Rome. He's told to withdraw from Egypt, or it would be considered an act of war against Rome. So right now you think you're going to beat up on the Ptolemies. No, you're not, because they're under our protection. If you don't get out of here, you're going to have to deal with us. And because Antiochus had spent those 12 plus years, or 12-ish years in Rome, he knew what that meant. What's interesting, and this is why I love history, okay? That's why I love history. historically, and I don't know if this is true or not, but it's a great history story, and it'd be a great preacher illustration as well. You know, a lot of illustrations that preachers use probably aren't completely historical, but we use them anyways because they get reused and used over again. So Gaius meets Antiochus and says, you need to leave. And if you don't, it's going to be an act of war. Antiochus says, I'll think about it. Gaius draws a circle in the sand around Antiochus and tells him, you think about it before you leave that circle. I suspect there were other people to witness that. So now Antiochus has been humiliated. What do you think Antiochus does? You've already got your papers, He leaves. Okay? He withdraws from Egypt. There's no good time to go to war against Rome, and this is certainly not a good time, so I'm going to leave. Don't you love stories like that? Draw a circle in the sand. Think about it before you leave that circle. Gaius, by the way, has no army. He's just the ambassador. Gaius has no army. Antiochus is at the head of an army. And still he withdraws from Egypt. All right, well, that's great for the Egyptians, not so good for the Jews. Because Antiochus is this kind of a guy that does not like to be told no, but he gets told no by the Romans, and he's got to go with that because the Romans are really, really strong and powerful. The Jews, not so much. So that lays the foundation for the persecution of the Jews. Now, the chronology in this period gets very, very difficult. Not all sources are in agreement. Okay, so we're going to do a very brief overview of what's going on. In 171 BC, Antiochus removes Jason and appoints Menelaus, who is a Benjaminite, as high priest. Can a Benjaminite be high priest? Raise your hand if you think a Benjaminite can be high priest. No one's raising their hand. Good, all right? You cannot be a high priest if you're a Benjaminite, but Menelaus is appointed. Jason's out. By the way, Jason's a Hellenist. Jason paid money. What do you suppose Menelaus probably did? Probably paid more money. By the way, Menelaus, that's a very Jewish-sounding name, isn't it? No, not at all. It's a Greek name, okay? So one Hellenist gets replaced by another Hellenist. In 168 BC, while Antiochus is in Egypt during that second campaign that we talked about, Jason attacks and captures Jerusalem with a force of about 1,000 men. Jason says, wait a minute, I'm the high priest. I don't really care that Antiochus made you the high priest. I want to be the high priest. I'm going to get an army of 1,000. It's not a very big army, but he attacks and captures Jerusalem. All right? This is not going to go well because that means Jason is fighting against who? Antiochus. Okay? He's fighting against the guy who is king. All right. So, Antiochus, he's coming back from Egypt now. All right? And he hears something's going on in Jerusalem. Well, we're going to have to go up there and take care of that. So he goes up and they attack. He and his army attacks Jerusalem. When the city falls, he turns his soldiers loose to massacre the civilians. That happened anyways in the ancient world generally when a city fell, but this isn't encouraging, okay? You go in there and you massacre these civilians, and let's make an example of what not to do against Antiochus. Because remember, he's got an empire to protect. And he just got told by an ambassador, get out of Egypt. Now he gets back to his empire and he finds out Jerusalem's in rebellion. What's going on up there? We got to deal with this because if we don't, then you got these people over here and these people over here and these people over here. And they're going to think I am weak. And when they do, they're going to seek an opportunity. The worst thing a superpower can ever do is appear weak. Because if you do, there's always somebody out there in some little guerrilla group somewhere, or maybe even somebody that's got, 1 billion people that might decide to take advantage of that. And that's where Antiochus IV is. I can't appear to be weak, so I'm going to have to deal with this. So he deals with the city of Jerusalem. Menelaus is restored. That's who had bought the office, and that's who was removed. And now Antiochus is going to put him back as high priest. Antiochus then desecrates and plunders the temple, and the walls are torn down. And I'm going to give you all a quote here. This is from 2 Maccabees chapter 5. 2 Maccabees is one of those books of the intertestamental period that we will talk about later in this class when we talk about that as a topic. Right now, suffice it to say, It is a very good historical book. 1st and 2nd Maccabees are our primary source material for the history of the Jews during this period. There is none other, okay? It is primary source, and it is very good stuff. Is it inspired? No. So does it belong in the Bible? No, but it's good history, okay? So 2 Maccabees chapter 5, verses 11 through 14, when news of what had happened reached the king, he took it to mean that Judea was in revolt. So raging inwardly, he left Egypt and took the city by storm. He commanded his soldiers to cut down relentlessly everyone they met and to kill those who went into their houses. Then there was massacre of young and old, destruction of boys, women, and children, and slaughter of young girls and infants. Within the total of 3 days, 80,000 were destroyed, 40,000 in hand-to-hand fighting, and as many were sold into slavery as were killed. Understanding that sometimes in the ancient world numbers got inflated, understanding as well that this is not inspired, okay? This is not God saying this, this is a Jewish historian saying this, but even at that, this is significant death and destruction in Jerusalem. So 40,000 are killed in the fighting. 80,000 are killed total. Because once the city falls, all the old men, all the young men, those who are not of fighting age, the women, the young girls, and the babies, the infants, they're killed indiscriminately as well. And oh, as if that weren't enough, those that don't get killed, we're going to sell into slavery. This is not Jewish slavery. This is not at the year of the Jubilee you get freed. This is not Jewish slavery where you are treated fairly well. This is slavery in its ugly, worst form that was fairly typical in the ancient world when you were a war captive. You were sold, and your master could do with you as you pleased. And so that's a significantly large number of people that suffer as a result of Antiochus IV coming up against the city of Jerusalem. Beginning then in 167 BC, we get forced suppression of Judaism. Because after all, what is it that makes the Jews different from everybody else? Their religion. So if we're going to keep these people under control, his attitude, remember Antiochus III the Great? His attitude is we're going to resettle you and you get to obey your laws and everybody's going to be happy. And were those Jews up there in Phrygia and Lydia happy? They were. These Jews down here, Antiochus IV, he takes a different approach. We're going to have to get rid of this law because this is what makes them different. This is what keeps them from becoming good Greeks. And so we're going to force suppression of this religion. The Sabbath and the Jewish feasts, any observance of those things is absolutely forbidden. So you cannot rest on the Sabbath. You cannot observe the feasts, the Day of Atonement and others, all those that we're familiar with in the Old Testament. You can't observe those at all. By the way, what happens if you do? Guy that killed all those people in Jerusalem has absolutely no problem killing you if you don't obey the law. All right? So it's a pretty serious thing. Circumcision is forbidden. Every Jewish male was supposed to be circumcised on the 8th day, right? Greeks viewed that as mutilation. Who in the world would ever mutilate the human body? Because in the Greek idea, in the Greek way of thinking, the human body is absolutely beautiful and perfect. That is why, if you ever go to Europe and you visit the art museums, or if you go here in America and visit the art museums, be prepared that people in the ancient world that were being portrayed on statues are not wearing loincloths. Okay? Because the Greeks looked at that and said, why would you cover that up? So you're not going to circumcise. That's a mark of your law. Plus it's mutilation. It's completely anti-Greek. Not going to do that anymore. Copies of the Hebrew scriptures are destroyed wherever they can be found. Anytime they can find some, they're taken out and destroyed. It is the ancient equivalent of banning books or burning books. Okay? In this particular case, they're not just banned, they're actually destroyed. That's going to happen later, much later, in a different period when Christians are under Roman persecution. The Romans will also be trying to get copies of the New Testament books so they can destroy them. Because what they recognize is it is the Hebrew scriptures from which this religion comes. If we're going to destroy the religion, we've got to destroy the book. Now, I got like a minute to go down a rabbit hole. Brothers and sisters, Christianity is built on the New Testament. What we do as Christians is built upon God's revealed word in the New Testament. We need to be people who know the New Testament. Because if we don't, there isn't anybody out there that's going to burn the New Testament. Well, hopefully not. But it's the same end result for us when we are ignorant of God's Word. Okay? Religion of Christianity is built on the New Testament, just like the Old Testament, Judaism, was built on the Hebrew Scriptures. An altar to Zeus was set up in the temple. This place where God had been worshipped, where sacrifices had been made to God. Antiochus says, we're going to build an altar there to Zeus, who of course is the head Greek god. All right? This particular event, and I want you to remember this, was referred to by the Jews as the abomination of desolation. Okay? That is terminology that comes out of the book of Daniel. Jews of this period said it's referring to this. Jesus in the New Testament, in the book of Matthew, will use that same reference to refer to what? The capture of Jerusalem. Okay? So is there a contradiction between the two? There is not. Because both of those are the abominations that make desolate. It's God's place being desecrated. Okay? And so what's talked about in Daniel, it applies in both of those places. All right, we'll talk about the prophecies of Daniel later in this class. All right, so what else can we say? Persecution of the Jews. It's a very dark period. Syrian, Macedonian soldiers, Antiochus' soldiers, commit fornication in the temple. Okay, who are they committing it with? Prostitutes, probably. Okay. Smaller altars are set up throughout the land and the villages to enforce worship of the Greek gods. Remember that for Wednesday night. It's not just Jerusalem. Everywhere where these Jews live, we're going to set up little altars so that the Jews are going to worship the Greek gods. No more worshiping Jehovah. All right, another quote. This one's lengthy, okay? Several slides. We'll just move from one to the next. Not long after this, the king sent an Athenian senator to compel the Jews to forsake the laws of the ancestors and no longer to live by the laws of God. Also to pollute the temple in Jerusalem and to call it the temple of Olympian Zeus, and to call the one in Gerizim the temple of Zeus, the friend of strangers, as did the people who lived in that place. Gerizim. Who's those folks living up there? Samaritans. They're worshiping Jehovah as well, just differently than the Jews. Going to make another one up there. Another temple up there. Harsh and utterly grievous was the onslaught of evil. For the temple was filled with debauchery and reveling by the Gentiles who dallied with prostitutes and had intercourse with women within the sacred precincts, and besides brought in things for sacrifice that were unfit. So what things are unfit for sacrifice to God? Pigs. Greeks really like pigs, okay? They're like Americans and bacon, right? You can put bacon on anything and it will taste good, regardless. It's like salt. Well, they're bringing those animals in and sacrificing them. They are not clean animals. They're not allowed for sacrifice under the Jewish law. Next slide. Sorry, I got to pull it up there. I don't know what I just did. There we go. The altar was covered with abominable offerings that were forbidden by the laws. People could neither keep the Sabbath nor observe the festivals of their ancestors, nor so much as confess themselves to be Jews. On the monthly celebration of the king's birthday, the Jews were taken under bitter constraint to partake of the sacrifices. And when a festival of Dionysus was celebrated, they were compelled to wear wreaths of ivy and walk in the procession in honor of Dionysus. At the suggestion of the people of Ptolemaeus, a decree was issued to the neighboring Greek cities that they should adopt the same policy towards the Jews and make them partake of the sacrifices. So even Jews that are not living in Palestine proper, in the neighboring areas, they're going to be forced to do these things as well. And should kill, verse 9, this is from 2 Maccabees, and should kill those who did not choose to change over to Greek customs. One could see, therefore, the misery that had come upon them. For example, 2 women were brought in for having circumcised their children. They publicly paraded them, those are the women, around the city with their babies hanging at their breasts, and then hurled them down headlong from the wall, from which they did not survive. That's implied, even that's not stated. Others who had assembled in the caves nearby in order to observe the seventh day secretly were betrayed to Philip. Philip, by the way, is in an earlier text identified as the governor of Jerusalem, appointed by Antiochus. And were all burned together because their piety kept them from defending themselves in view of their regard for that most holy day. So once again, we see the Jews not fighting on the Sabbath. They're in the caves observing the Sabbath. They don't fight back. The Greeks burn them. Okay? Anybody who's attempting to follow God's law. All right. The stage now is set. There's our first bell. Stage is now set for the next period of Jewish history, which is the Maccabean Revolt. You can treat people like this only so long before somebody is going to say enough. And that's what's going to happen about that Wednesday night. Antiochus IV dies suddenly of disease on 164 BC, and the details of his death are recorded in 2 Maccabees chapter 9. I hope no one is planning to eat a snack right after class. Shouldn't be doing that anyways. Here it is. I'm going to read this for you, okay? But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, remember this is Maccabees, it is written by Jews. They talk about God. The all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him, that's Antiochus, with an incurable and invisible blow. As soon as he stopped speaking, he was seized with a pain in his bowels, for which there was no relief, and with sharp internal tortures. And that very justly, for he had tortured the bowels of others with many and strange afflictions. Yet he did not in any way stop his insolence, but was even more filled with arrogance, breathing fire in his rage against the Jews, giving orders to drive even faster. And so he's in a chariot. And so it came about that he fell out of his chariot as it was rushing along. And the fall was so hard as to torture every limb of his body. Thus he who only a little while before had thought in his superhuman arrogance that he could command the waves of the sea and had imagined that he could weigh the high mountains in a balance, was brought down to earth and carried in a litter, making the power of God manifest to all. If this sounds like Herod in the book of Acts in the New Testament, it's pretty close. And verse 9, and so the ungodly's man body swarmed with worms, and while he was still living in anguish and pain, his flesh rotted away. Because of the stench, the whole army felt revulsion at his decay. He is literally rotting to death. That sounds an awful lot like Herod in the New Testament. And in the New Testament, we read specifically that God did that, don't we? All right? Kind of makes you wonder whether maybe, just maybe, the writer of Maccabees got it right, and God is doing this to Antiochus IV. If I had to take my bets, I'd bet God gets rid of Antiochus IV in the way that is described here in 2 Maccabees. However, we don't have inspired book, chapter, and verse, so I can't make that a dogma. All right, so that is the Jews under the Seleucids. That was our first bell. We're going to go ahead and finish class Wednesday night. We're going to talk about the Maccabean Revolt and Hanukkah because they go together. Thank you all very much.